All right, well, the President and other government officials have said that COVID, this pandemic we've been in the midst of, does represent an opportunity, in fact, for South Africa to re-engineer the economy to deal with inequality and the plight of the poor. Tonight, we're asking if today's budget enforced or undermined that goal. As they were discussing, there were increases to social grants, but less than inflation, which essentially means that some of the poor are getting poorer in South Africa. There are many priorities, but South Africa's debt repayments are eating into its ability to spend on other things. Well, let's discuss. We're joined by Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective and Economic Analyst Lebohang Pheko. Lebohang, great to have you with us, as always. Firstly, our debt is the main issue on the table, perhaps. There have been repeated promises over the years to get this under control. Do you think that the Finance Minister's path laid out today is, as he claims, sustainable to get us out of this potential debt trap that we're in?
Thanks, Francis. As you rightly say, we've been on this path for many years, and it's not something that has, it's something that's been, it's an inheritance, a perverse inheritance, but it's also the perverse inheritance of the kind of multilateral, international, globalized economy that we chose to enter into in 1994. So in order to sustain and to participate into the economy, we've incurred huge amounts of debt. Some of it is intergenerational debt. Now, even though the minister has promised that there won't be any more direct taxes, there won't be any increases in direct taxes, he's also mentioned that in the same breath that several SOEs face defaults. So I suppose the subsidies for those have to come from somewhere. And even though he promises that he's going to soften the blow, especially for the household consumer and for smaller businesses, it should also be borne in mind that there's much less money circulating in the economy at the moment. Despite this, the COVID relief fund, I think only about a third of it that had been originally allocated has been expended. So for small businesses and for relief packages. This basically means that most businesses and most industry are operating suboptimally, with the exception of the agricultural sector and to a lesser extent the exception of the mining sector, which are both extractive in different ways. But everything else is much more sluggish than usual, as we're also aware that employment figures, even the unofficial employment figures, which are becoming officialized, are at over 43% now, and even the official figures, which are the massaged, more generous interpretation of unemployment, are at 30.8% as we speak now. None of this really is a recipe for dealing with the jet to GDP deficit. And I don't know if there's anything that's particularly encouraging that one can glean from the minister's speech today.
Well, let's focus. Let's focus on a few issues. Social grants are important to you, going up, but less than inflation. Is that fair enough? I mean, when so much money is being spent on interest payments, when we're trying to get out of debt, on the other hand, the social need is so huge. Is that fair enough?
I don't think it's fair enough, Francis, and I'll tell you why. Particularly because we are so fragile, economically and socially fragile. There are a couple of things that the social grants do. Of course, they do support a net of some kind. So they are psychological relief that people desperately need right now to avoid and to avert the very difficult, the basic day-to-day survivalist tactics that we might be forced to, such as begging, quite frankly, and such as the risk of losing one's home, the risk of going to bed hungry, and so on and so forth. But I think the other piece of that is that in the meantime, we also need to create the sorts of support systems that enable people to not only survive this moment, but to transition into a vibrant and robust economy going forward. My concern is that, A, we don't have a very robust economy to go into. But the second thing is that, of course, what this also has done is that it is building a intergenerational and ongoing pattern of perpetual precarity and precariousness. And most people in this country would be what I'd call the working poor or the non-working poor. And what COVID has done is that it's just highlighted the forms of precarity.
So I mean, there was this ideal of using COVID, using the efforts around COVID to actually re-engineer the economy, to make it more equal. Have you seen anything like that, or is that just a pipe dream? I mean, one of the things he did mention was a transformational fund for tourism. So you do have support for black entrants coming in. Is that where maybe government spending can make a difference, or would you have liked to have seen much more?
I would have loved to see more, and I think that still feeds into the throw money at it approach to this. Now, remember that in terms of tax relief, there were 70 billion rands worth of tax deferments, which were suggested at some point. And as you rightly say, this includes feeding into particular sectors. The tourism and the hospitality sectors have been quite vociferous in their concerns, rightly so, in some respects, that their industry has been taking a beating. But this also included I think tax breaks, a 3 to 4 month tax holiday, for example, VAT refunds, etc. And it's very difficult at the moment for many businesses to access these relief funds. The paperwork is quite onerous. You have to go into bank, your banking, you need a bank account, you need a CIC number, you need to talk to the company's registration authorities, and all of these things which are quite prohibitive for a small business. You need to get your accounts in order and so on. So it's almost like you need to be clean to get cleaner. And that sort of has not really been very helpful at a time such as this, when we actually need much more business to be functioning, particularly because those are where most employment opportunities lie. 60 to 70% of people are employed in the small business sector, and I've been saying for many, many years that that's really where the state and government and the budget needs to really provide far more subsidies, and including differentiated interest rates or interest-free loans for medium to long-term capital expenditure and so forth.
Okay, so you wanted more funding for small business, but less sort of risk assessments. Can we take that risk and sort of give money to people who haven't proven themselves? I mean, is this where government needs to be brave?
Look, it depends what we mean by proving themselves, and I don't think that we should per se be. I'm not sure whether it's a balancing act between being a Father Christmas state, which people often accuse us of being a nanny state. I think that's spectacularly unfair to some degree. But I do think that certainly with the correct remediation, remember that we do have in this country, Francis, the kinds of industries and the sorts of institutions that should ideally be helping small businesses along. We have the National Empowerment Fund, you have the IDC, you have CETA, and so forth. So you do have the kind of institutions which ideally each of them have each or all of them have provincial presence. So they ought to be accessible to small businesses. They ought to be a bus ride away, a train ride away, a drive away, a taxi drive away, to support businesses on the ground a bit more efficiently. Yeah. Remember also that we're dealing with a debt service costs which were higher than the 2020 budget estimate. So where then are we going to generate this extra income? How are we then going to galvanize the economy to do that which it needs to do, which is to support us, to excite us, to feed us, to nurture us, and to give us opportunities?
Yeah, it's so difficult. Very briefly, just finally on tax. I mean, there was some tax relief aimed at those lower income brackets, but then the fuel levy goes up, and some experts would say that's very fair. If you ride, if you're using a car, then pay the money. But what about the millions of South Africans who take taxis, who see those taxi fares go up each and every time any sort of fuel tax goes up?
Yeah, that's kind of an ongoing taxation. That's also to do with the reality that taxis are not very well regulated, or they're not evenly regulated in this country. They have not wanted to come to the party per se for, if ever really, and there's a sort of kind of a political and historical context to that. But I think that that's part of the problem, that they're completely self-governing. They put up taxi fares at their own discretion, and that's really a double, triple tax for people who don't necessarily have the leeway to make different choices about their means of transportation, don't necessarily afford cars. And this is the unfortunate thing, that many people in this country, a majority of people in this country, spend up to a third or even 40% of their income getting to and from work. And then we want to talk about building a culture of savings. How does a person save under those circumstances?
All right, thank you so much for your analysis tonight, and we'll continue to bring you different voices on the budget speech tonight. That was Lebohang Pheko, a senior research fellow at the Trade Collective.